Hey everyone. So, kind of rounding out what we've talked about so far now with geochemical cycles, I wanted to talk about the transfer of energy within the environment as well as food chains, or should I say, food chains? No? Okay, moving on. So, when we look at energy flow within the environment, a lot of this has to do with what we've kind of already talked about with geochemical cycles. There's energy that gets put into the system and then it moves throughout different levels, mostly through the food chain. We've got the sun here providing energy for producers, or what we call autotrophs, organisms that make their own food. So they convert this sunlight into energy. And again, when we're looking at these yellow arrows, this is the energy movement. And the black arrows, some of which are on the inside of the yellow arrows, indicate the mineral nutrient movement. So multiple things are moving together. Autotrophs are being eaten by herbivores are being eaten by carnivores, and when all three of them die off, they get broken down by decomposers. So we've already talked about like fungi and bacteria that'll start breaking these things down, and then they provide mineral nutrients that are usually inside of the earth or inside of the water, depending on where we're looking at this system. So again, we're already kind of familiar with how these things move around with regard to the food chain. So here I want to talk a little bit more about what it means for an animal to be a producer, or excuse me, for an organism to be a producer versus a consumer. So a producer makes its own food through photosynthesis or chemical sources. So here in our picture, our grass would be an example of a producer. So plants are producers. There are some other organisms that are also producers that go through photosynthesis, but plants are the big one that we think about. Whereas we have a lot of different consumers. So producers, for as important as they are as the basis for this, there are a lot of consumers that are basically eating at different levels of the food chain. So one of our types of consumers is a herbivore, so like our goat inside of here. Herbivores get energy by eating producers. So again, that's their primary food source. A carnivore is also a type of consumer. It gets its energy by eating other consumers, so other animals. An omnivore gets energy by eating producers and other consumers. So they do a mix of both. Humans, for the most part, are considered omnivores. We are able to eat and digest plant material and meat material to get what we need. And then finally, when we look at decomposers break down dead organisms in an ecosystem and return nutrients into the environment. So again, they're very important for these things to cycle through. So what we're going to look at here are a few pictures to kind of help get your mind flowing. But again, you can pause the video when you're looking at each one of these to take some considerations for each of these categories. So first, I want you to think about what are some examples of producers. And again, we've got a field out here of plants. So plants are primarily the producers that you're going to think of. But what would be some examples of producers? Okay, so here we're going to be looking at what are some examples of herbivores, animals that eat plants. And again, we have a couple of cattle here inside of the picture as some examples, but think a little bit further. What would be some other examples of herbivores? Okay, moving on to here, we've got a pride of lions here. These are carnivores. So what are some examples of carnivores? Animals that only eat meat. So again, if they eat a combination of meat and veggies or other plant products, they would be considered an omnivore. But if it eats only meat, like a lion, it would be considered a carnivore. What are some examples of carnivores? Then moving into here, we're going to talk about what are some examples of omnivores. So think through this one. Bears are a good example of omnivores. They eat a combination of some meats that they encounter in their environment, like fish and bugs and smaller animals. But they also eat lots of plants. They eat lots of fruits and veggies when they can get a hold of them, sometimes fungus and stuff like that too. So these are animals that are considered omnivores. But what else would be considered an omnivore? Okay. And here we're looking at mushrooms. Again, we've been using them a lot as our example for decomposers, talking about different types of fungus in general. So think about what are some examples of decomposers. A lot of times we think of fungus. We talked a lot about bacteria, especially with the nitrogen cycle. But what else will help with breaking down dead material, causing it to break down into smaller pieces and be recycled into the environment? You might also think of certain insects at certain stages in their life that may contribute as being decomposers as well. Okay, Let me move my video here. So, two things that I want to kind of discuss as far as the differences are food chains and food webs. So, you've probably heard of these before if you've kind of looked at the relationships between prey and predators. But what I wanted to talk about is the importance of the two diagrams. A food chain is pretty linear, so we just see this relationship. Here we've got like a little crustacean amphipod being eaten by a small fish, bigger fish, all the way up to a bird of prey that can eat the fish. So the food chain only explains to us a linear pathway, one single direction up. So we do understand that for the bird at the top to get all the nutrients it needs, it does depend on these bottom levels to be plentiful. But that's not totally the way that this works out in nature. Normally, this bird has to eat a lot of different sources of fish in order to get its energy. In fact, it might eat some like the perch here that are here in the middle because it may not always have large fish available for it to eat. So it may eat a variety of the different fish on here. Probably nothing as small as our little amphipod because it'd be very tiny, very hard for the bird to capture it. But this is what we look at when we're talking about a food web. The fact that certain animals can be food sources for multiple predators, and that predators usually have to get multiple sources of food. So when we look at our producers down here at the bottom, we have things like seaweed as a plant, phytoplankton as far as a microorganism that helps start. So with the way that the arrows are moving, the energy transfers from the food to the consumer. So again, where the arrow ends up is where this thing is being eaten. So our producers tend to be the start of certain arrows as they move up the food web, basically. But when you see things that we refer to as top predators that don't have other animals that consume them, like our killer whale here, we'll see that there are several arrows that travel to them. So the killer whale has to eat the elephant seal, the penguin, the leopard seal to get a variety of food that it needs in order to survive. But it's supported, again, if we keep following down, the penguin and the elephant seal are both supported by the squid. The leopard seal has to eat the penguin as well as the seagull and some fish. So the way that these things move around isn't necessarily super straightforward. Excuse me. But the food web gives you a better impression of how these things function inside of the actual environment because most organisms don't specialize in just one type of food. Usually they need several things to support them. This also gets us to talking about energy transfer. So when one organism eats another organism, energy is transferred from the eaten organism to the eating organism. Again, that's the whole reason why we eat, is to get energy. During the transfer, some of that energy is lost as heat or during cellular respiration. So only 10% of that energy becomes part of the organism's body. So if you thought of eating lunch as being like eating $1, and I know that sounds kind of weird, you would only basically be getting a dime's worth of energy. That's how little energy organisms get from eating what they eat. So again, we have to consider the fact that 10% means that organisms have to usually eat quite a bit in order to meet their energy needs. And again, it's going to depend on how much energy they're getting from particular types of food. And that's a whole kind of more complicated process. But 10% is the biggest factor that we're looking at here. Each level of consumption is called a trophic level. Trophic just refers to eating. For an ecosystem to be balanced, there needs to be more biomass on the lowest trophic levels and less biomass on the high trophic levels. When we say biomass, we literally mean how many living things there are. Bio, again, meaning life. Mass, literally referring to how much matter is being in this area. So if we think of an ecosystem having so many living things, that's the biomass of that area. And here's an energy pyramid that we're looking at. So this kind of shows us how our balance would ideally look. So down here at the bottom, we've got our producers. We've got lots of different plants down here at the bottom, 4 different kinds, so that this helps provide a really sturdy, large support for the whole pyramid. Then we've got our herbivores, our primary consumers, here on the second level of the pyramid. Again, quite a few herbivores that can make use of the plants. When we go up one level from that, we start to see carnivores. Secondary consumers is what we refer to them here. Occasionally they're omnivores, it just depends. But these are animals that are eating some of the herbivores. They may eat things on lower levels as well. But again, we need there to be fewer of these animals if they depend mostly on these animals for their survival. So things like the snake that would eat something like the squirrel if they can get a hold of a younger squirrel. That's kind of how this end works. And then finally, for our very topmost carnivores, our apex predators or tertiary consumers, like our fox here, they want to be here at the very tippy top, but we don't want a lot of competition between them. If there were multiple top predators all competing for the juicy organisms that are here in this environment, it'd be very hard for them to survive together. So there can only be a few top carnivores in an environment. Again, lots of producers, a few primary consumers, a little bit less secondary consumers, and only a little tiny bit of tertiary consumers to help keep everything balanced. So again, I hope that this helps analyze a little bit about how energy transfers within the environment. Again, this ties a lot into how predators and prey interact with one another, how they eat one another. But I hope that this shed a little bit more light in how energy works in the natural world.